I just wanted to say thank you so much for giving us the time. You are like famous in our books, and we are really appreciative of being able to tap into that brain of yours.
Yeah, well, it has some miles on it, so go easy on me, okay?
So we'll go very easy.
We had a buddy of mine does a little podcast, or I guess it's a webcast, Bob Trainer, and so I made the mistake of telling him that it had been 50 years since the first time I actually fit a hearing aid. I was in the U.S. Army. It was unethical to fit hearing aids in the U.S. until 1977. But I was an active duty U.S. Army. And so in the Army, you could fit hearing aids. It was okay. So I actually started fitting hearing aids to people in 1971. And so Bob thought that was entertaining enough that we did a little half-an-hour show on 50 years of Gus, which is pretty darn boring. I got to tell you that.
Boring for some, but like amazing for others. It was 11 years before I was even conceived. So that says something.
Yeah, well, it's and times have changed, certainly in the hearing aids, but some things stay the same. Some things stay the same.
But I'll just remind everyone how famous Gus is to us. He's been an audiologist for over 50 years. And he's internationally known researcher, lecturer, editor, author. He's been a fixture in the audiology community for decades and has served in various roles in industry, academia, administration, publishing, and he currently has a private consulting practice nestled between, do you say the tundra?
The tundra, yeah.
The tundra, and
it's sod, basically. It's undeveloped dirt.
Okay.
That has grass
and reality.
on it, probably.
Okay.
Normally found in Alaska. It's normally found in Alaska, where nothing will grow.
All right.
So it's a little play on Alaska.
And since the early 1990s, audiologists have been treated to Gus's monthly journal columns, now numbering over 300. And originally his work appeared on page 10 in the Hearing Journal. And for the past 12 years, it's been 20Q with Gus in Audiology Online, where he is a contributing editor. Dr. Gus Mueller holds faculty positions with Vanderbilt University, University of Northern Colorado, and Rush University. He is a contributing editor of Audiology Online, a consultant for WS Audiology, and a consulting editor for Plural Publishing. He is the founder of the American Academy of Audiology and a fellow of the American Speech and Hearing Association. He has published extensively in the areas of diagnostic audiology and hearing aid applications, and has co-authored 10 books on hearing aids and hearing aid fitting, including the recent 3-volume Modern Hearing Aid series and the clinical handbook Speech Mapping and Probe Microphone Measures. Gus is the co-founder of the popular website eartunes.com and resides on a North Dakota island just outside of Bismarck. So that's Gus. One day we'll be privileged to come and see you in what it sounds like a most beautiful island.
Well, it's a little sandbar, but it's surrounded by water. So technically, if something's surrounded by water, you're allowed to call it an island. So
we in South Africa here, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and Gus has been very generous with his early morning time with us. So thank you so much. It's 8 o'clock in the morning there, I believe.
That is true.
My name's Cara, and I'm an audiologist in Durban in South Africa, which is the east coast of South Africa. And I've been in practice for about 11 years, and we've got quite a fully diagnostic practice where we focus on all age groups, all age ranges, and various technologies. So we work with hearing aids, we work with assistive listening devices, we work with implantable devices, both cochlear implants and bone-anchored hearing aids, and auditory processing assessment and diagnosis and management, vestibular assessment and management, tinnitus, industrial audiology, and almost everything in between. So that's us. And then I'm going to hand it over to Sybrand to introduce himself.
Yeah, Gus, it's really good to meet you, even though it is on the web. But I'm Sybrand Strauss, and part of the APPF Audiology Private Practice Forum here in South Africa. And my practice is in lovely Cape Town. That's why I do notice the wine bottles there behind you, I think.
I've had a fair amount of the Sauvignon Blanc from Cape Town to be.
Lovely. And so I've been practicing for 14 years, but I've had my practice here in Cape Town for 6 years now, recently 6 years, and keen interest in tinnitus as well. But really looking forward to chat to you today about best practice and this fairly recent document that you've compiled with the Audiology Practice Standards Organization. And looking forward to chat to you about that.
So Gus, the Audiology Private Practice Forum, or APPF, was born about just over a year ago, where we have a need and desire as independent private practitioners in South Africa to upskill each other, to support each other, and to be able to create differences and add value to our services so that we can fulfill everything, or all those roles, and offer those services that are so important for us in our practices. So not just fitting hearing aids, but everything that leads up to the fitting of the hearing aid and thereafter. So we are trying to encourage the public to learn a little bit more about independent audiologists, and also to try and educate colleagues as well about making the right choice when opening a practice or going into practice. So that's where APPF comes from. And we're not an association, we are not a governing body or a legal body, but we're a non-profit company that is basically pooling resources together amongst ourselves to increase awareness, to increase marketing, and our structures that make us a little bit more accessible to the vast majority of the population. So that's where we're at. We currently have 52 members, representing just over 74, 75 practices in South Africa, which makes APPF the biggest representation of independent audiologists in the country, and we're growing. So this is the beginning of our first international interviewing process or podcast process, where we want to learn from those people around the world who have so much experience. We would love to hear also about your opinion on over-the-counter hearing aids, online sales, direct to consumers, all of those things that challenge the service provision and the outcomes in hearing aid fitting. So that's where some of our questions are going to lie. And I'm going to hand it over to Sybrand to ask you the first one.
Gus, let's dive straight into it. So let's call it recently, but I believe it was in 2020 that you published a new standard for best practice in audiology. And I just want to know from you, the discussion around having a best practice standard, because there are guidelines in audiology, but you, together with a couple of other audiologists, have published this new best practice standard. So maybe we can first dive into it, and you could just explain, why a standard for best practice? Because there are guidelines, but why a standard?
Hey, excellent question. And let me first say that sort of the ringleader of that particular group, which, by the way, is very Googleable, APSO, the APSO standard. The ringleader, John Coverstone, really was the one who collected a group of, I think, of 6 of us, which he termed subject matter experts, and then we all got together. So I was just one of 6 people. I did happen to then write a review article at 20Q where I interviewed some of these people. So I'm just one of the people in there. As far as guidelines go, I've been involved in the writing of 4 different guidelines over the years. The first one was in 1990. And we published that in Audiology Today, and also again in the ASHA magazine. I think it was just called ASHA at that time. The interesting thing, and that it's not only interesting, it's important. What is in this standard that was just published 2 years ago is not all that different from what we said back in 1990. There are still the right things to do and the borderline things that one could do, but isn't quite as good as it could be. To more specifically answer your question, there's been a lot of guidelines published. There were those that we've published here. There's actually been 5 set of guidelines published in the US. The British Academy of Audiology has guidelines. The International Society of Audiology published guidelines about 8 years ago. There's a lot of guidelines out there. And we thought that the problem sort of is it's a guideline. Drinking white wine with fish is a guideline. But sometimes I go crazy and have Pinot Noir with my salmon. So the thought was there should be something above a guideline that maybe has more teeth. So when you go to somebody and say, I need $20,000 to buy probe mic equipment, and the person says, well, is that a standard? It would sort of be nice to say, yes, it is. Whether or not this new document gives us any teeth, I don't know. And, if you think of the way things should lay out, you would start with a standard. Then after you have your standard in place, then you would develop guidelines which expand on the standard. And then after that, you would have best practice guidelines, which would really fine tune things. We're sort of going backwards. We had asked our professional organizations to come up with a standard, and none of them really wanted to call it a standard. And I think partly that's because what do you then do when one of your members don't follow the standard? Probably nothing. And if that's the answer, then maybe you don't need a standard. So there's pros and cons of a lot of this, but we felt it needed to be called a standard. And again, I say it's mostly the founders of that group, the APSO group. And I was not one of those, but I certainly quickly bought in. That was a long answer to your question, I know.
No, that's good. And again, from my side, thank you for doing that as well, because it really does help to have a document like that. And you also mentioned it is viewable online, and we'll chat about that just a little bit later. But it's really nice to have something like that one can have a look at. Gus, so I want to go also on the actual standard points, and we can talk a little bit about that as well. The first thing that I wanted to know is I had a look at that 20 questions roundtable discussion that you also interviewed some of the other audiologists. But I want to know from you, the first thing in terms of a needs assessment, is there a particular favorite that you have or something that you would recommend?
So, there's a lot of ways to do a needs assessment. I guess if you have a very good case history form, that could be adequate. I have to first say I'm no longer fitting and selling hearing aids, although I did for much of my career. But I think if I were to have my own office, as the viewers do, I think the main thing is to have some structured self-assessment inventories. And what you don't want to do is have something where you're sort of measuring the same thing over and over. So I would want to have a variety. I would probably pick the HHIE, HA. By the way, those two have been blended together, and there's a new form now. And I don't know what initial they're using, because that's been done. It has so much research behind it. And there's a lot of data. Larry Humes has probably published the most on this, to show that the HHIE or A probably is as good as picking who's going to benefit from hearing aids as the audiogram. Okay. In fact, he found no difference and showed that, look, because of course, as we all know, patients need to want to have hearing aids. They need to admit they have hearing problems, and that drives then use and acceptance. So I'd pick something like that because it's looking at emotional, social issues. And it's easy. So, the screening version is very adequate, 10 questions. I would maybe then pick the AFAB, just because there's a lot of research on that. And that gives you a different idea now. That really looks at how people are doing in the real world on 4 different listening situations. And then third of all, the favorite of everybody, which starts off as a blank sheet of paper, is the COSI, because now you can drill down to the very, it's like a contract with the person. You know, if you were having somebody build you a house or whatever, you'd say, I want this granite in my kitchen, and I want this, and I want this. So you're sitting down with the patient and you're coming up with the 3 to 5 items where this patient really wants help. And then it's up to us to solve those problems. So the AFAB is very general, where now you can go in and this person wants help when they're playing cards or with their grandchildren or watching TV or whatever it would be. I'd pick those 3. You don't need a ton of college to administer them. So they could be done, you could mail them to the patient. It could be done by a receptionist. They shouldn't take a lot. It would be nice if they were already completed by the time you first see the patient. That would be my goal. And I think they cover a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And so there's audiologists sitting here as well, and we're talking about best practice, Gus. I think oftentimes if you have been in practice for quite some time, you've got your routine of the way that you do things, and oftentimes you might think in your head that the guidelines that you are following are best practice. And something like, let's take speech and noise testing, for example, that might often be overlooked by an audiologist in their assessment. Can you maybe talk to us about why something like speech and noise testing is important as best practice?
Wow. Where do I start? I mean, let me give the obvious example. You know, when you walk into an optometrist's office and tell them you're having some trouble seeing at a distance, they sit you down 20 feet from a Snellen chart. If you say you're having trouble reading, they hand you another chart that you hold at arm's length. You test for the problem. So when people walk into the audiologist's office, 90% of them are going to say, I have trouble testing in background noise, and 90% of audiologists do a test in quiet. That's crazy, you know? You got to test what the problem is. I mean, if you walk in your doctor with a sore elbow, they don't have you take your shoe off, you know? So, I mean, it's so simple. And people say, well, gee, I don't have time. Well, if you have time to do speech in quiet, then you have time to do speech and noise. If you had to do one of the two, you'd pick speech and noise, because speech and noise always predicts how good speech and quiet is. Speech and quiet only about half the time predicts how good speech and noise is. The main advantage of it, it may not change the hearing aid that you fit. I mean, you're probably going to fit directional microphone technology to everybody. You're probably going to fit noise reduction to everybody. But what it does change is your counseling. If you have a patient and you see that their SNR 50 is plus 12, that's a totally different patient that has an SNR 50 of plus 4. It's different restaurants they can go to. It's different problems they're going to have. And if you don't know that, I don't know how you do your counseling, because that, you know, you need to have realistic expectations. When the patient comes back and complains they couldn't hear in a given listening situation, what I immediately do is calculate, that SNR was about plus 5. This person isn't ever going to do well in plus 5 unless they have a remote mic. So now I can drive my counseling in that direction. Had I not done speech and noise testing, maybe I might pull out my mouse and start knocking up the highs or increasing something else. Or it's just a basic piece of information that we need. That's my short talk on that, by the way. Patients are going to be given themselves speech tests at department stores before audiologists will be doing it routinely. I'll bet on that. They'll be in a kiosk going, well, my audiologist never did this, but this is a pretty cool test.
Couldn't agree with you more. So there's also a large body of research that has shown that recorded speech testing is more accurate than live voice, and that we know. But would you recommend any particular speech and noise tests in specific? And my other part to the question was, are there any norms for the various protocols for different age groups and different hearing loss? So apart from gaining a better understanding of the patient's capabilities and being able to counsel effectively, and being able to advise, for example, on remote microphones. How else would one use those results clinically, apart from all those the obviouses? And my other question is, would you use it to compare how well someone does with different levels of technology, knowing that their underlying hearing and speech and noise capabilities are compromised? Yeah, so that's really what I'm trying to know is there a norm for specific age groups, and do you have a specific test, a speech and noise test in mind, or recommendations? And thirdly, what else would you use it for apart from choosing a device and getting accessories?
Okay, hopefully I can remember all those. Well, first of all, I'm going to answer your third or fourth question first, and that is, you've read and heard all these things about hidden hearing loss. Maybe the only reason it's hidden is because we're not routinely doing speech and noise testing. I'm guessing a lot of that isn't hidden. So right away, there's an excellent reason why you would always do speech and noise testing, even if the person had normal hearing. There are some data from the group out at Stanford University. Fitzgerald, I believe, is leading that research. He's now done the quicksand on hundreds, if not thousands of people. And he's actually been, it's been somewhat useful in finding retrocochlear pathology. So there is that added benefit. It's certainly going to be more successful than using monosyllables and quiet, which are just way too easy to be sensitive to any kind of subtle central auditory deficit or eighth nerve pathology. So that's sort of a sidebar. I wouldn't say that's the main reason for doing it, but that's a side benefit of just doing it routinely. Now, back to your first question. Here in the US, the most popular test is the quicksand, and it's relatively easy. It's easy to obtain. It indeed is relatively quick. There's 6 sentences per list, and you would always do 2 lists, and you score. There's 5 keywords in every sentence. So after 2 lists, you now have 60 items that are being scored. So when you're now looking at statistical differences, when is a difference really a difference? You got your count up to 60. So that's pretty good. So then relatively small differences will be significant. Usually an SNR difference of about 3 dB or so will be significant. So another application would be, let's say you had somebody with a symmetrical hearing loss, but they say, I only want 1 hearing aid. I'm only going to buy 1 hearing aid for whatever reason that is. How do you pick the ear? Well, you may have some strategies, but what if this quicksand score was SNR loss of 3 dB in one ear and 8 dB in the other? Well, you're going to go with the ear that has the 3 dB SNR loss because you know that will give you the best results, because people always perform bilaterally as good as their best ear, or maybe better. So I assume the quicksand is available for you all. Hopefully the language differences wouldn't be so much that you would need your own norms. There's lots of norms for the quicksand. The manual that comes with it gives you all kinds of norms. There's been research done that has looked at list equivalency. So there are certain lists that you would not use, but all of that is available. That's the test I would recommend. I guess second in popularity maybe is the Hint, just because it's used around the world. It's a little more difficult to administer and score. Here in the US, it's no longer sold as a standalone test. And there's another test that's been well researched, developed by Richard Wilson, called the WIN, the Words and Noise test. So that would be a third one. Those are the 3 that have been used the most clinically, with the quicksand by far being the most popular. And you had one other question, I think. Did I hit on most of them? Just
about whether you use it for anything else apart from counseling and expectations, or would you use it to upsell, or would you use it to change technologies?
Yeah. Okay, no, because I think the sensitivity, it's not really what it's designed for. And the sensitivity is such, I don't think that you probably would see. I mean, if you compared omnidirectional to directional, and you did all the testing correctly, and you had 3 or 4 loudspeakers, and you had uncorrelated noise, and you had speech coming from the front, you'd probably see a 3 or 4 dB advantage for directional. But if you're going to compare, but after that, you're going to see very small differences. I don't think it would be worth your time investment. No, it isn't like the patient's going to go, oh, wow, now I understand everything. What I always used it for was to compare unaided to aided, okay? We know that what the patient needs the most is audibility for soft speech. For some reason, we like to fit the average level inputs, but really research has shown that what they get the most benefit from is giving them audibility for soft, because most of them only have a mild to moderate hearing loss. So what I like to do is, after you've already fit the hearing aids correctly using probe mic measures, then do unaided versus aided bilaterally in sound field using the quicksynth at a relatively soft level, probably around 45, 50 dB HL, which, if you're doing it with your audiometer, would be about 35 dB HL, which would be around 50 dB SPL, which is soft speech. You could maybe go 5 dB louder. And then you compare unaided versus aided, just to show the patient that hearing aids work in noise. If they don't do better with aided versus unaided, then maybe they don't need hearing aids, because it's usually they do pretty poorly unaided. So no, I'm not going to change programming because of that. That's just to give the patient a shot in the arm that hearing aids work as the last thing before they leave. Because again, the patient's going to say, I came in here complaining I couldn't understand speech. You never even tested me wearing my hearing aids. How do you know I'm any better? And you'd say, well, because I fit you to target. They go, well, but you didn't give me any speech. So it's, if you have the time to do it, that's a nice way to use the quicksynth. But I wouldn't use it for a technology demo. I don't think it could come back to bite you, because it could very well be that the very best technology won't do any better than entry level, for just because the test there's a lot of variability in the test, about 3 dB.
That's good, Gus. I want to stick with the theme of tests that might often be overlooked, and I want to know from you. Last year, you worked on a maximum power output project with, is it Yu Xiang Wu and Elizabeth Stangl?
That is
correct.
At
the University of
Iowa.
Iowa.
University of Iowa. Yep.
I just want you to also speak about what's the importance of an audiologist doing frequency-specific MPO changes, and why not just use the manufacturer's recommendations? Is that not best? Is it a good measure? Why would you, as an audiologist, go and tune that specifically?
Well, thanks for handing me the softball. That's an easy one. Obviously, you read the article. Wow. Well, where do I start? Well, first of all, in that article, we show what manufacturers recommend. This is all for a NAL fitting. So in all their software, we put in NAL, NL2, and we looked at a couple things. What was the real output, and what did they recommend? Among the 6 leading manufacturers, what they recommended differed by 25 dB. Now, you would think that the NAL, Harvey Dillon's group, has MPO recommendations in the NAL software. So one would think that if you were fitting to the NAL, each manufacturer would simply go to the NAL and say, okay, 95, 98, 105, 105, 110. But no, these things are all over the place, as low as 85 and as high as 115 or something like that. So there's your first problem. And secondly, fitting hearing aids is what we do. Manufacturers build them, we fit them. It's a nice differentiation. I have never tried to build a hearing aid in my life, and it would be a piece of crap if I did. But I think I'm pretty good at fitting it. So the only way you're going to program the MPO is you have to know, what am I going to program it to? Ruth Bentler showed us 15, 20 years ago that average LDLs vary by about 50 dB for people with the same hearing loss. Okay, that tells you can't use average. If you're going to program the hearing aid, you need frequency-specific data. So you simply do your frequency specific LDLs at maybe 2 or 3 frequencies is all you need, because they don't go all over the place. They stay pretty much the same, even when the hearing loss changes. So once you have your HL values, you simply take your conversion, what are called Retzmals, and you add that to your HL values. Now you have 2 CC values. So if the LDL was 100 and the Retzmals 3, you know that in a 2 CC coupler, that patient's LDL is 103. You go to the MPO section of your favorite hearing aid manufacturer and you set the MPO to 103. I mean, this is pretty basic stuff, really. Programming the MPO I think is critical. It's like the Goldilocks thing. It can't be too low and it can't be too high. You need it just right. Today, manufacturers, well, it's difficult to get into in a short period of time, but the end result is manufacturers are underfitting people with gain. And because they're underfitting, we're now ending up with MPOs that are actually too low, which is strange because I'm old enough to remember when MPOs were too high and we had to keep turning things down. But yeah, it's the quick answer is we fit hearing aids. That's what we do. That's why we're always going to win when we're competing against mail order and over the counter and all that, is because we know how to do it better. We know how to do it better than the manufacturer. We know how to do it better than the patient. That's why the world needs us. So we just need to do our job.
That's very interesting. The fact that the MPO is too low in some cases, because exactly as an audiologist, when you don't have the complaint then of the patient saying sounds are too loud.
Yeah. Well,
Well,
this is part of that article and I won't go into too much detail, but the bottom line is if you use the proprietary fit or the manufacturer's NL2, people are being underfit by about 10 dB for soft sounds. Okay, so that means if you're underfit by that much for soft and you have wide dynamic range compression, what you do, the wide dynamic range compression is limiting the output, not the MPO, the AGCO, which should be. In the study we just did, there were 3 manufacturers that when you fit to their NAL target, the maximum output was 80 dB. Okay, that's 80 dB. Now imagine if you fit a patient and you didn't do probe mic and you didn't fit them correctly, and they go out in the real world and they come back to you and said, boy, I was in a noisy restaurant last night and I couldn't understand a thing. Well, you wouldn't expect them to, because even if their partner was talking louder than the noise, everything's at the ceiling at 80 dB. So what might have been a plus 10 dB SNR turned out to be a 0 dB SNR because everything's right at the ceiling. You can't appreciate that extra 10 dB because you limited the output 20 dB too low. My guess is the average audiologist isn't going to go in and say, oh, Bob, I know exactly the problem. I need to raise the MPO. I don't think that's going to happen, unfortunately. But that's what should happen in many of these cases.
So interesting.
And that's why having it too low can be almost as bad as having it too high.
It's fascinating because that also then confirms for me in my own mind of obviously the risks of buying over the counter or buying a self-fitting hearing aid. There are massive risks not only to poor quality hearing and poor experience, but also either under or over amplifying and not having the correct testing. You know, a lot of people now I'm seeing this, the new trend as opposed to fit based on a screener, to fit based on just air conduction. Yeah. No speech discrimination even, and certainly no LDLs or LDLs being tested. So that's frightening. That's frightening how much it can vary.
Yeah, you know, it's a tough topic because indeed it's a trade-off. You know, we want accessibility, and indeed, if this allows a lot of people who otherwise wouldn't be able to obtain hearing aids or wouldn't be able to use their hearing aids, if it opens the door for them, you know, that's a good thing. On the other hand, it would be nice if they had a good fitting so that their initial experience was positive. You know, when I think about how well do patients know what's really best for them, I usually go back to a study that Larry Humes published in 2017, where he had different groups, 3 different groups of people. One group was fitted by audiologists. Another group, there were pre-programmed hearing aids. And in this group, the patients picked what they liked the best. On the third group, the hearing aids were, for each individual, were programmed for 0 dB gain. It was the placebo group. And there was about 50 people in each group. At the end of the 6 weeks trial, these people all paid for their hearing aids, but they were told that at the end of the experiment time, they could come back in and they could get their money back. Well, of the people who were programmed with 0 gain, 32% kept their hearing aids.
Wow.
So that tells me a lot of how good are patients at picking what's best for them. If they want to keep and pay a lot of money for hearing aids that have no gain.
Jeez, that's interesting.
So the people fitted by audiologists, 80-some%. The Bose people did a study that was encouraging, and they showed that with their system, that when people program the hearing, and they started them out at 0 dB gain, but allowed them to program it, that they came reasonably close to the now prescription. It sort of surprised me because patients tend to usually underfit themselves, but they came reasonably close. That's one of the only studies I think that shows that patients will fit themselves to the now. Now, the opposite of that is when they're fitted with the now and you give them trainable hearing aids, they don't train away from the now. So that to me is good support that the now works.
Absolutely. Do you have a plan B when we talk about verification and real ear measures? And when we do, if you had to do a fitting with a good diagnostic audiogram with LDL, frequency specific LDLs, and in situ audiometry, and placing the patient onto, say, the maximum adaptation or optimal adaptation, and then popping them in the booth and doing aided testing, pure tones and speech perception. Would you think that that is sufficient for fitting a hearing aid if a person does not have real ear measures?
No. First of all, you tossed in sound field testing. There's been a ton of articles written on why that test is invalid. And it's even more invalid today because we have expansion in every hearing aid. How are you going to get an aided threshold when the hearing aid has expansion? Expansion doesn't care if it's noise or speech or a tone. So expansion is simply going to lower it and the person won't hear it. That's the beauty of probe mic. You can test above the expansion knee point and then extrapolate back to what their aided threshold would be or their predicted aided threshold. The retest reliability of sound field testing is off the charts. David Hawkins published that. It's about 10 dB, plus or minus 10 dB. You have to mask the non-test ear. There's noise from the hearing aid that will mask out some of the signals. So you got all these things going on. I don't think it would be, I wouldn't put sound field thresholds down into a medical record. I'll tell you that. I don't think it would give you any benefit. I don't think there is a second choice. I mean, I can tell you right now that most manufacturers now, and this isn't just me, it's several articles, we know that the manufacturers now, this is if you push now in their software. This, by the way, is why in situ testing really doesn't help much because you still end up using the manufacturer's target, which is not the real now. So we know that the manufacturer's now is going to be down about 3-4 dB. It'll be okay up till about 1500 to 2. Then it'll be down about 3-4 dB at 2. It'll be down about 8 dB or so at 3, and it'll be down around 10 to 12 dB at 4. So I guess if you had to have a plan B and you couldn't afford to lease a probe mic system for about $100 a month, about the cost of a good bottle of wine, but if you couldn't afford that, you could fit to the manufacturers now, then go to soft program for soft and do those correction factors that I just told you. On average, that's what it's going to be off. It's too bad to resort to that, but I think it'd be better than sound field testing. At least now you have science to back you up.
Absolutely. So when you talk about verification and real ear measures, we obviously see a very big variety of products that are coming our way and updates in technology. Some are portable, some are touch screens, some are connected to other screens. What would you say are important features to look for in a machine if someone is investing in real ear measurement? And do you have a special favorite?
First of all, cost probably does matter. And I think there's probably, I don't know how this relates to your dollars, but I'm just going to throw out US dollars. The costs probably vary from around $5,000 to more like $13,000, $14,000, depending on. And then it's going to depend on, do you want it to integrate with all your other systems? And so there's some factors like that. As far as the probe mic measures itself, all of them now, I believe, you need a good input signal. And the ISTS clearly is the winner there. It's on all probe mic systems. So they're all going to have a good input signal that's well studied and commonly used. And you want to have the ability to do then all the standard testing that has been around for the past 40 years almost. And all the systems, I think, have that adequately. You know, some of the other features that some systems are better at than others. If you work a lot with infants and toddlers and you want to do a lot of RECD measures, there are some equipment makes that a lot easier for you than other equipment. If you don't plan on doing RECDs, then maybe that isn't that important. You know, there's other features now. I mean, the probe mic systems calculate SII, and I think most all of them do that. They have an automated system. When you slide the probe down in the ear, it automatically tells you when you're within 5 millimeters of the eardrum. They calculate RMS error for your fittings to know when you're close enough. And I'm not talking now about something that's just unique on one or two companies. That's pretty much across the board, those kind of things. The only thing I'm not fond of is one company in particular advocates the use of doing live speech mapping, which is as pathetic as doing live word recognition. You know, you need a calibrated input signal, and you need targets that have been verified over 30, 40 years, such as the DSL or the NAL. So you need a target. And if you're going to fit to the target, you have to use a calibrated signal. And those calibrated signals, the best one is the ISTS. So, you know, this live speech mapping, I guess people think it's cool and patients probably like it. Oh, look at there, Betty, I can see your voice on the screen. Isn't that cute? So, you know, as a sales gimmick, I think it's fine. But to fit a hearing aid, you need a calibrated input. And that's the one thing to be careful with is it doesn't work as well on all systems, is to make sure when you're fitting to target that you're using the input signal that corresponds to that target, which is the International Long-Term Average Speech Spectrum. You know, having any one of them is head and shoulders about not having any of them.
And I think that's the take-home message, because we've been chatting today with members, in fact, about finding out which members of APPF have verification and who's in need. And initially, I think people are also a little bit defensive when it comes to not wanting to admit that they don't have verification. It was no judgment, but I get where they're coming from. But at the end of the day, a lot of them are now, they're looking at all the different products and what each product does and what this company offers. And so it's important for us to be able to sift out what is marketing babble, just like when we see hearing aids with different features that are either appropriate or not appropriate, and look at the fundamentals. And what you're saying is that all the machines will have the fundamentals in place for what we need
Absolutely.
To obtain. Okay, so that's,
you know,
that's
I
wonderful.
mean, you can talk about all the bells and whistles that you want, but what is the overriding factor that's going to trump everything is audibility. And the only way you're going to know that you made soft sounds audible is by doing probe mic measures. There's all kinds of research going on brain plasticity and data showing that if you're not making soft sounds audible, the brain plasticity may not occur at the same rate than if the person had an appropriate fitting. Well, the more that the plasticity occurs, the more that the temporal lobe gets back involved in doing what temporal lobes are supposed to do, the better people are going to do in background noise. I mean, we know that. And so this is a critical thing. And the biggest problem, so it's interesting, the thing that's the most important is the biggest mistake that's being made if you don't use probe mic, because all the proprietary algorithms seriously underfit, usually by around 10 dB. And yet that's the most important, is gain for soft.
Gus, so during a roundtable discussion, just keeping on this theme that you had, there was one point where you also welcomed Mike Valente quickly, and he said, I quote from that article, he said, a well-fitted hearing aid is the sum of the hearing aid and the services provided by the audiologist according to the best practice. Let's call it now the APPF standards. Sure. That's been done. Can you maybe just, although we've covered that ground, but just motivate again to any audiologist watching now?
I can. I like to use the data that was collected by Ron Levitt, Carol Flexer a few years back, where they looked at, they were looking really at a couple things. And one of the things they looked at was 6 premier hearing aids, and they looked to see what would happen if you compared a proprietary fit to a probe mic fit to target. And so what happened was, when they first did proprietary fits, they got SNR loss down around 10 to 16 dB, and it varied by manufacturer because different manufacturers have different proprietary fits. Then they programmed all of these hearing aids to the NAL. And when they programmed to the NAL, they basically were all these hearing aids were the same. And they were about, on average, 8 dB better in SNR. So to get to your point, yes, technology matters, but when you program them correctly, the hearing aids all turn out about the same. So it really is the person, not the hearing aid, which is why it's okay to charge for our services, because people will be in trouble without them. But if we are charging for it, then you better darn well be doing it. And so that's it's programming correctly always will be better. A crappy hearing aid programmed together is always going to beat out a super hearing aid not programmed correctly, just because audibility is so important.
Thank you. And I think that is, it's motivational also for our colleagues to know that they're on the right track, and also for the public to understand what goes into just fitting a hearing aid. It's not just following the software and kind of gauging, maybe I should increase this frequency or decrease that. There's a science to it. And it's really important that whoever you go and see, you're going to see an independent audiologist who has verification at minimum. I wanted to ask one last question.
Sure.
Do you have any audiology hacks that you could recommend? Things like, for example, I work in a pediatric practice, and we just did fitting yesterday, and we could not, for the life of us, get that probe mic to stay in. This child would not let us do it. So what we wanted to know is, do you have any hacks that you can share with us? If you don't, it's fine. But
well, of course, relative to that comment, one of the keys is to use, 2 things with adults and children, is to use a little bit of a lubricant on the tube itself. And secondly, always put the tube behind the lanyard. You got a lanyard coming down, right? Always put the tube behind the lanyard. Some people like it. It's a little more work to get it behind there to begin with, but it'll be payoff in the end, because then that holds the tube right next to the head. One other tip, though, with adults that was just brought to my attention 3 or 4 years ago, and now I've looked at it myself, and that is with this whole thing of people liking now to use instant fit ear molds. You have to realize that when you're using closed, even if it's the double dome, these are not very closed. If you look back at the literature that we probably were taught at some point in school, the data, and if you like, I can share the article with you, is in Hearing Instruments, Hearing Review. In a closed instant fit mold has the same leakage as a custom mold with a 3 millimeter vent. You're losing about 12, 15 dB at 500 hertz, which means you won't have the directionality you want. You won't have noise reduction in the lows because everything's going straight to the eardrum. So I think because we see a package and it says closed, it's real tempting to think that it's closed. It's not, it's open. And there's literature on that showing curves. And that's something that I found people have said to me, I never really thought of that. No wonder I'm not having the occlusion effect, because I have a big slit leak there. The problem is they're much, much shorter than a custom mold. And so when you have a slit leak, if it's a short distance, you get a lot more leakage than if the slit leak is for a long distance. So these molds are not technically vented the way we think of a vent, but they are vented by the rim around it is what's causing the venting. So good to know when you're trying to get gain in the lows that if somebody really needs a fair amount of gain at 500 hertz, you need a custom ear mold. You can't use one of these. That's the bottom line, I guess.
That's interesting.
It's also if they come back and saying that the noise reduction isn't working as such. And by the way, with your probe mic equipment, you can find this out very easily, simply doing the test called the REOR that looks at how much is leaking into the ear canal when you have the ear mold in place and the hearing aid turned off. So you can test that very easily. It would be a routine part of the hearing aid fitting, I would think. And if people did that routinely, then I wouldn't be giving this tip because you'd all already know it. But it isn't, the REOR isn't commonly done, even by people who do probe mic on everybody.
A lot of people, I get patients that come in if they've been fitted somewhere else and they say, oh, they've changed this dome. We started with an open dome and they've changed it to, what do they call it? They called it a buddy dome or a dummy dome or something crazy. Those little jelly beans, we used to call them jelly beans. But yes, it clarifies a lot because we see the difference when we make custom made molds or canal tips. Yeah. Absolutely.
No, granted, these instant fit probably are more comfortable, but I think you might have to resort to that at the end. But I would at least start with a custom mold, and then if they simply couldn't tolerate it, you could give in to the instant fit rather than using the instant fit as the go-to.
That's interesting. I'm gonna ask my last question, and then I'm gonna hand it over to Sybrand, who's gonna close for us. But I just wanted to know, what do you have a favorite memory, something memorable in audiology that you can share with us? A fun story, something that's a little bit fun and different for us to listen to.
This little gig's going to last about 5 hours, did you say? Or now I do have to go get at least a mimosa to go through this. Now I'll try to keep this as quick as I can. So I was in the U.S. Army, and I was stationed in San Antonio, Texas, and our former president of the U.S., President Lyndon Johnson, when he no longer was president, he moved to his home in Texas. And so he came down to the Army facility for all of his care, and he wore an eyeglass cross hearing aid. And my boss, who was relatively experienced with hearing aids, was gone on leave or vacation. And I got a call that said the generals, he had heart problems, the generals up at the VIP suite, he has a problem with his hearing aid. We need it fixed today. So somebody showed up with the general's hearing aid, again, an eyeglass cross, and immediately I could see the tubing. He was a heavy smoker. The tubing was dark orange and all crimmed up and everything. So I stayed after work and I had to cut the tubing off of this, cut it off the nubbin where it was attached to the eyeglass frame. And I worked and I took a paper clip and I bent it perfectly, and I took new tubing and put it on there. I heated it and the whole thing, And I mean, his old tubing was cut into shreds just to get it off. I put it all up there. The next morning, I run up to the hospital at 7 a.m. and I delivered it. And I was so proud of myself as a new lieutenant in the Army. I'm back in my office, and pretty soon the same aide who had, not that aide, but the general's aide, shows up at my door and goes, Lieutenant, he hates this. He's incredibly pissed. He wants his old tubing back. So that's my best story. So I made a president very upset. I said,
You got to see the president. That's pretty cool.
That tubing is in 20 pieces in the garbage, and he has to live with this new tubing. So that's my best hearing aid story of bad luck with the ex-president.
Gus, thank you so much. It was really good to talk to you. And I wanted to say, like, we've listed your credentials in the beginning, but I just want to say thank you for keeping audiologists on their toes. And I think the heart always behind the standard is for best practice for the patient, to walk out of the audiologist practice and be satisfied with what they've got. I think a lot of the things, you know, it might sound obvious, but it's good to hear them again. And it's good to hear somebody with your reputation to say, well, this is going to be obvious, but I'm going to say it anyway. It's good to hear it again. And yeah,
well, you mentioned Mike Valente name, who's a good friend of mine, and he and I are about the same age, and he just retired, by the way. And you know, we've been talking the same story for 35 years. And it's sort of, he and I agreed, you know, once you get old, you can be a little crusty. You know, you really don't have to be polite anymore, because polite isn't working.
Yeah.
So maybe I was too crusty, but oh well.
Gus, if we ever come to North Dakota, then it would be so nice to come and visit you. And
I don't know if you can see, it's a little dark back there, but I do have this bar back there that would be waiting for you if you can see that. There's a pool table right here. So, and there's an ample selection, whatever your favorite beverage is. It's always
nice,
open.
sounds good.
We call it the Gastro Pub.
We would have to bring some South African wine, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I still have a bottle of your whatever that fruit beverage is from my last visit to South Africa.
Amarula.
Yeah. Although after hauling it home and going through customs and all that, I found out that they sell it at a liquor store 2 miles down the road.
I'm sure it's cheaper here than it is over there.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, but it was worth the memories just to bring it along.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gus, for helping with us understanding a lot more about clinical best practice protocols, and we can't thank you enough for your time. We're so appreciative.
I enjoyed every minute, so thank you for the invite.
And I heard today someone send me a message and an email, and he ended the email to say, I hope you have a powerful rest of the day. So I hope you have a powerful rest of the day.
All right, I'm ready. I got a PowerPoint to get finished. So
yeah, there you go. So PowerPoint.
Exactly, a PowerPoint. All right.
Thank you so much.
You bet.
Bye.
See you next time.
Definitely.